Okay, now that we've covered the Truman years, now we're going to look at the Eisenhower years, which lasted from 52 to 1960. In the election of 1952, Republicans nominated war hero Dwight D. Eisenhower, also known as Ike, with VP running mate Richard Nixon. He had a spotless reputation, he was known for his integrity, and he was really known for being a war hero of World War II. The Democrats nominated Illinois Governor Adlai Stevenson, who obviously lost in this election if you look at the map. So Ike was a fiscal conservative. He wanted to balance the budget. He was a moderate on domestic policies, and he called his new balanced and moderate approach modern republicanism. He established the interstate highway system, which authorized the construction of 42,000 miles of interstate highways linking all of the nation's major cities. This created jobs, promoted the trucking industry, accelerated the growth of suburbs, and gave us a more homogeneous national culture. This also justified new taxes on fuel, tires, and vehicles to improve the national defense. Not a whole lot of focus was placed on public transportation or the environment with this new highway system. If you look at the map here, you can see the interstate highway system as it was created under that act. So we see a lot of prosperity in America post World War II. The per capita disposable income of Americans more than tripled, and the average American family had twice the real income of comparable family during the boom years of the 1920s. So lots and lots of disposable income right now. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, yes, that's who Dulles Airport's named after. He wanted to liberate captive nations of Eastern Europe and to encourage the nationalists in Taiwan to assert themselves against China. Ike held Dulles back from being too extreme, but Dulles had a lot of diplomacy ideas. As for nuclear weapons, Dulles placed a greater reliance on nuclear weapons and air power. In 1953, the US developed a hydrogen bomb which could destroy the largest cities. Eisenhower basically came up with this plan of massive retaliation. So it was kind of a threat thing where we said, okay, if you use force against us, we're going to use everything we've got against you. And the Soviet Union adopted a similar policy. So it was kind of a really scary time because everybody was like, well, we don't know if we're going to get attacked and then what's going to happen, and we're afraid the whole world's going to blow up. It was this whole new fear during this time period. Also, after World War II, we have a lot of decolonization. Dozens of colonies in Asia and Africa gained their independence, either through formally requesting it or whatever. So that led to a requirement of a lot of foreign aid from either the Soviet Union or the US, which ultimately led to these nations kind of being indebted to the country that gave them money and helped them out. So they become like little pawns in the Cold War. We also participated in some covert actions in other nations. Like in 1953, the CIA helped to overthrow a government in Iran. And in 1954, the CIA overthrew a leftist government in Guatemala to protect American business interests. And we kind of sort of planned some assassinations of national leaders. So we were a little bit sketch in what we were doing. Yeah, just gonna leave that there. As for the Korean armistice, in 53, we exchanged prisoners. Most American troops were withdrawn. Korea is still divided near the 38th parallel, and we still have no peace treaty today. Now, Indochina was an area in Asia. So French lost their colony to the Japanese leaders in World War II. They tried to retake it, but there was a lot of resistance. The US gave support to the French forces, and then China and the Soviet Union actually got together and gave support to the Viet Minh guerrillas, who were led by Ho Chi Minh. At the Geneva Conference in 1954, France agreed to give it up and divided the independent nations of Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. Vietnam was temporarily divided so that a general election could be held, but it still remain divided. North Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh established a communist dictatorship. In South Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem was supported by anti-communist, Catholic, and urban Vietnamese. So 55 to 61, the U.S. gave over $1 billion in economic and military aid to the South Vietnamese to help build a stable anti-communist state. We were afraid that if one nation fell to communism, the other nations around it would also fall, known as the domino theory, which you can see kind of pictured there on this slide. In the Middle East, we got a lot going on. We have support for a new state of Israel after the Holocaust and everything, Jewish homeland. But we also had support for the oil-rich Arab states. In the Suez Crisis, Egypt asked the U.S. for funds to build the Aswan Dam project on the Nile River. The U.S. refused because Egypt threatened Israel's security. Nasser then turned to the Soviet Union to help build the dam. In 1956, Nasser seized and nationalized the British and French-owned Suez Canal that passed through Egyptian territory, which threatened Western Europe's supply line to Middle Eastern oil. Britain, France, and Israel then surprise attacked Egypt and retook the canal. The U.S. was pretty mad about being kept in the dark about the secret attack on Egypt. As for the Eisenhower Doctrine, it was the leading Western influence in the Middle East, but they faced growing Soviet influence in Egypt and Syria. So the U.S. pledged economic and military aid to any Middle Eastern country threatened by communism. This was applied in Lebanon in 1958 to prevent a civil war between Christians and Muslims in Lebanon. We also see OPEC. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Iran, Venezuela. They created the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC. We also see maybe a thaw in U.S.-Soviet relations. The Spirit of Geneva was a conference in Geneva in 1955 between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Maybe we're doing some good things. Then in October 1956, there was an uprising that overthrew a government backed by the Soviet Union in Hungary. Khrushchev sent in troops to stop the Hungarians from withdrawing from the Warsaw Pact, and this Soviet suppression of the uprising ended that first thaw in the Cold War. U.S.-Soviet relations also got a little more strained when the Soviet Union launched the first satellites, Sputnik 1 and Sputnik 2. The U.S. was not technologically ready to send any satellites into space. So in 1958, the National Defense and Education Act was signed and authorized to give hundreds of millions of federal money to schools for math, science, and foreign language education. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration was also created to direct U.S. efforts to build missiles and explore outer space. We were afraid of nuclear war, and it was intensified by Sputnik. We were afraid that missiles that launched the satellites could also deliver thermonuclear warheads anywhere in the world within minutes, and that there was no defense against them. In 1958, Khrushchev gave the West 6 months to remove their troops from West Berlin. Eisenhower refused and invited Khrushchev to Camp David in 1959, where they agreed to stop the crisis and scheduled another meeting in Paris in 1960. Then came the U-2 incident, where Soviets shot down a high-altitude spy plane, the U-2, over the Soviet Union, which exposed the secret U.S. tactic for gaining information and made Khrushchev really mad, and he walked out of the Paris meetings. We also have Fidel Castro overthrowing Cuban dictator Batista in 1959. He nationalized American-owned businesses and properties in Cuba. He was a Marxist, and he set up a communist totalitarian state. So Eisenhower cut off trade with Cuba. Cuba turned to the Soviets for help, and Eisenhower authorized the CIA to train anti-communist Cuban exiles to retake their island. As for his legacy, he claimed credit for checking communist aggression and keeping the peace without the loss of American lives in combat. He is also known for expanding the military-industrial complex, which left a negative impact of the Cold War on U.S. society and a fear that the U.S. was becoming a military state. During this time, we also see the civil rights movement. In 1947, Jackie Robinson became the first African American to play on a major league team since the 1880s by being signed to the Brooklyn Dodgers. Prior to this, you have segregated teams. In 1948, Truman integrated the armed forces. And in the 1950s in the South, African Americans were segregated from whites in schools and public facilities. They were kept from voting by poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and intimidation, which left African Americans poorly educated, while economic discrimination left them in a state of poverty, a continual state of poverty. African Americans increasingly joined the Democratic Party, and the Cold War caused people to think about racial segregation and discrimination as against democracy and freedom. So we now have a movement to desegregate the schools. Plessy versus Ferguson was a Supreme Court case in 1896, which stated that facilities could be separate as long as they were equal. Well, Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas in 1954 came about to say separate is inherently unequal. So key people of this Supreme Court case. Barbara Johns was a student leader in Prince Edward County, Virginia. Thurgood Marshall was part of the NAACP legal defense team. Oliver Hill was part of the legal defense team in Virginia. And Earl Warren was the Supreme Court Chief Justice. Marshall argued that segregation of Black children in public schools was unconstitutional because it violated the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection of the laws. This overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. Chief Justice Earl Warren ruled that separate facilities are inherently unequal and unconstitutional, and that school segregation should end quickly. We have a lot of resistance in the South. The Southern Manifesto was 101 members of Congress condemning the Supreme Court for, quote, a clear abuse of judicial power. States temporarily closed public schools and set up private schools. This is known as massive resistance. Yes, Virginia took part in this. The Ku Klux Klan made a comeback, and violence against Blacks increased. And in 1956, Arkansas governor used the state's National Guard to prevent 9 African American students from entering Little Rock Central High School as ordered by a federal court. Eisenhower then had to order federal troops to stand guard to protect the Black students, which you can see pictured on the left. In 1964, less than 2% of Blacks in the South attended integrated schools. In 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white passenger. Martin Luther King then led the massive African American protest, the Montgomery bus boycott, in the form of boycotts of city buses. This sparked other civil rights protests during the time period. Some people will try to say Rosa Parks didn't know what she was doing. No, she 100% knew what she was doing. She was part of the civil rights movement before she refused to give up her seat. So civil rights laws were signed into law in 1957 and 1960, which provided for a permanent civil rights commission and gave the Justice Department new powers to protect the voting rights of Blacks. You also see a rise in nonviolent protests with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and college students in Greensboro, North Carolina started the sit-in movement after being refused service at the segregated Woolworth's lunch counter. And you also have the rise of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee as part of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So these are the gentlemen sitting at the Woolworth's counter in North Carolina. This section of the counter and their seats is actually at the Smithsonian for American History. As for immigration, Congress dropped the ban on Chinese and Asian immigrants and eliminated race as a barrier to naturalization, but the quota system still existed until 1965. Puerto Ricans entered the U.S. without restrictions because they're U.S. citizens, and Mexicans could work under the Braceros program or coming over illegally. Operation Wetback was a forced removal of 3.8 million people to return to Mexico. Obviously, very racist. As for popular culture during this time period, TV. Now we have one for every 3.3 Americans. National networks, which created sitcoms, westerns, quiz shows, showed professional sports. Funnily enough, the FCC worried about the impact on children of a steady dose of 5 or more hours of daily TV viewing. And the culture portrayed on TV provided for a common content for common language of third and fourth generations of white ethnic Americans. As for advertising, they promoted common material wants in TV, radio, newspapers, and magazines. We now have suburban shopping centers, plastic credit cards, fast food chains, and standardized products, which led to franchise operations. Paperback books were a new innovation. Before now, they were all hardback. You have almost 1 million copies of books sold per day by 1960. LPs, or long playing record albums, were inexpensively produced. So teenagers were able to fall in love with rock and roll. And Elvis Presley gained his fame during this time period. As for corporate America, conglomerates with diversified holdings began to dominate industries like food processing, hotels, transportation, insurance, banking. You've got more American workers holding white-collar jobs than blue-collar jobs. Large corporations promoted teamwork and conformity, including a dress code for male workers that included a dark business suit, white shirt, and conservative tie, which led to a loss of individuality. Big unions also became more powerful and more conservative during this period. As for religion, we have organized religions expanding dramatically after World War II, with new religious tolerance of the times. There's a lack of interest in doctrine as religious membership became a source of both individual identity and socialization. Women, homemaking became a full-time job for millions of women. The traditional role of women caring for the home and children was reaffirmed through mass media. Well-educated women of the middle class entered the workforce, and male employers saw female workers primarily as wives and mothers, and women's lower wages reflected that attitude. You have social critics with the failure of wealthy Americans to address the need for increased social spending for the common good. The corporate world was dehumanizing. J.D. Salinger wrote The Catcher in the Rye, which portrayed the individual's struggle against conformity and the phoniness as viewed by a troubled teenager. And then he also wrote Catch-22, which was a satire of the stupidity of the military and war. Beatniks were a nickname for rebellious writers and intellectuals of the 1950s, and they were led by Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg. They advocated spontaneity, the use of drugs, and rebellion against societal standards. So you've got a lot going on culturally during this time period.